I'm George Galloway, and I present Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kali Mahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kali Mahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Latin America, which is scarcely far from the news, and in the last months has been right at the top of the media and political agenda. Millions on the streets in Chile, in Ecuador, power changing hands in several Latin American countries, blood too on the streets, repression, violence, counter-violence, all a sense of insecurity and unfinished business. The United States, which in its Monroe Doctrine declared Latin America to be its backyard, never a flattering reference for a country to be someone's backyard, is once again allegedly right at the heart of events. In Brazil, Lula, the legendary workers' leader, has finally been released from what most people would regard to be unjust imprisonment, designed to stop him from running for the presidency against the current incumbent Bolsonaro. And Evo Morales, everyone's sweetheart leader. All around the world, people were shedding tears as they saw him head off into exile. His house ransacked, his sister's house burned down, his supporters being literally tarred and feathered, covered in paint, having their hair cut off, and people have started to die there. In Ecuador, huge mass movements of people forced the government to climb down from the cuts in people's living standards that they had promised to the IMF and World Bank, which they received huge subventions from, most people say, in exchange for the body still at this point alive of Julian Assange, formerly a guest of the Ecuadorian government at its embassy in London. Tremendous controversy, huge forces in motion. No one quite knows where it will all end up. In the words of Lenin, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Jacques Arnold, my old adversary in the House of Commons, doesn't like me quoting Lenin, but I will make this point from Lenin, that there are decades when nothing happens, but there are weeks when decades happen. And those decades are definitely unfolding in front of our eyes now. We have, as always, an audience of distinguished experts and 1 or 2 enthusiastic amateurs like me. And we're going to start with one of the most expert of them all, a student of all of Latin America, a teacher of all things Latin American, whose PhD happened to be on revolution in Bolivia. Dr. Isaac Biggio, thank you very much for joining us. Set the scene for the debate, will you?
We have in Mexico a new government, which is a left-wing. In Brazil, a new ultra-right-wing government. And now, in Argentina, we have a new government, which are the Peronistas are coming back. In Uruguay, we had elections, but I doubt that the left wing can keep that victory in the second round. At the same time, we have in Chile the largest demonstration in Chilean history, 1,200,000 people in Chile. And the people try to smash Piñera, that Piñera will be overthrown. At the moment, they couldn't do that. Piñera is staying in power, and he's making a lot of concessions, including calling for a new constitution. But he's deeply unpopular. And we have seen in Chile and in Ecuador big popular movements against the austerity measures. Paradoxically, in Bolivia, when we have a small movement criticizing Evo Morales, the army support the coup. A very important thing is in Argentina, they wanted to make a deal with Evo Morales. Evo Morales was re-elected with a popular mandate, but the United States, the Organization of American States, tried to overthrow Morales, don't want to recognize his victory, and they force a coup d'etat. Now this coup d'etat put in power a new president, who is a lady. It's called Janine Áñez. But the problem is this: she's worse than Guaidó, because at least Guaidó in Venezuela was elected by the parliament and has some popular appeal. She doesn't have any kind of popular appeal. She was not elected by the parliament because the parliament boycotted the session, and she is going to be a new puppet from the United States. At the same time, in Peru, we are going to have elections in January because the government closed the parliament. It was a very corrupt parliament. In this case, the USA didn't say nothing because they support the Peruvian government. But in Peru, there is a radicalization of the people against corruption. Then we have the situation in Colombia, that Colombia is trying to become the powerhouse of Donald Trump against Venezuela. Colombia is trying to overthrow the Maduro regime in Venezuela by any means, even by military means. The peace process in Colombia is torn apart. And the idea of Washington is to make a bloc between Colombia, Chile, Bolsonaro, to overthrow the governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And finally, we have a new change in Central America because the El Salvador government, who is a Palestinian by origin, Nayib, who used to be a left-winger, is now supporting the overthrow of the Venezuelan regime. So we are having a situation of deep instability in Latin America, and I think that we are going to have a lot of social unrest. I don't think the situation in Bolivia is going to calm down, and we are going to have more instability in the region.
Let me ask you two questions, please. One of the aspects of Bolivian affairs that is quite striking, at least to those of us far away, is the ethnic entanglement of politics here. It looks to me the optics are white oligarchical power has been restored in Bolivia, and the main losers are the indigenous inhabitants of the subcontinent. Is that right?
That is the case in Bolivia. In Bolivia, this is a constant struggle because between the right wing based in Santa Cruz, which is a westernized city, which a lot of influence from the Croat separatists, no? They are inspired by what happened in Yugoslavia, against the Indian nationalists, the indigenous people. Yes, that exists in Bolivia. And there is a big oppression against the indigenous people, the Mapuches in Chile, in Argentina, the Aymaras and the Quechuas in Peru, and the Mayas in Mexico and in Guatemala. So there is a tradition of repression of the indigenous populations, and also of the Afro-descendants.
And my second question, how secure is this lady whose name you almost forgot? And you almost forgot it because almost nobody ever heard it. She was not the rival to Morales in the elections. She did not have a quorum in the parliament which, quote unquote, elected her. Therefore, her appointment is entirely invalid, illegal. How secure is she in power?
I don't think that she's going to last too much time. Her only base should be the army. She doesn't have a political party behind her. Her party achieved only 4% of the votes in the election. It's the same party as they're member of the Democratic International as Donald Trump. They doesn't have too much support. Paradoxically, they say that it's a fraud in Bolivia, but they put in power a person that never stood in the election, was not re-elected. Her party only achieved 4% of the votes, and I don't think that she's going to last too much. The only way in which she can last is with the support of the army.
Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, Venezuela and Cuba were both mentioned there as the real targets of US policy in the region. Venezuela, maybe, you can never rule it out. I would have thought Cuba was beyond the reach of Donald Trump, but the fact that Dr. Isaac believes that these are the the double targets of events. Do you share that view?
Well, it's the stated objective of the US government. They called this the Troika of Tyranny. That's Nicaragua, Cuba and Venezuela, and they've been embarked on a plan to overthrow those governments. It's been stated as an objective by the leaderships. John Bolton, who recently left office, was the architect of this, but the people that are behind the US policy at the moment, particularly, for example, people like Ted Cruz, who, if you remember, was a Republican candidate in the elections in 2016. He's been the architect of a lot of the policies on Cuba.
Him and Rubio seem to have set themselves up as a two-man department, regime change department.
Yes, and of course they represent a particularly reactionary section of the Cuban, for want of a better word, exile, I call it emigre community in Florida. And they are people that were formerly, you would call the haute bourgeoisie of Cuba, that lost their properties to the Cuban Revolution, and they've never stopped wanting to get the properties back. So their objective ultimately is to overthrow the regime, as they call it in Cuba, and return to Cuba to administer it like they did before
And how
the revolution
realistic?
in '59.
How realistic are these ambitions on the part of the U.S.?
Well, I would call them Gatsby-esque myself. If you're aware of the novel The Great Gatsby, the idea that you can repeat the past is just redolent in the policy. They want to try and return to some status quo ante, disregarding the fact that such a long time has taken place between them, and it's absolutely impossible to do this. And of course, it doesn't take into account the fact that the populations of these countries will resist. And the resistance will be ferocious, and we're only yet beginning to see the beginning of it. But the people in, for example, Bolivia aren't going to take this lying down. And as you saw in Chile and in Ecuador, the masses are alive. They've been awoken by the processes that have taken place in the continent over the last 10, 20 years. And it's going to be a long time before these people will be placated, if they will ever be placated at all. So this is the beginning probably of a very long period of struggle.
Well, mass politics is definitely back in evidence for those who thought that mass politics was something from an earlier era. We've seen in Ecuador and in Chile, and I suspect we'll see in Bolivia, the return of mass movements of people. But will we get armed conflict, do you think?
I think it's a big, big possibility. And you have to remember the point that was made earlier about the role of the military, for example. The fact of the matter is that in Venezuela, the military is on the side of the Maduro government and shows no signs of switching sides. They are part of the revolutionary process that was unfolding there. And any intervention in Venezuela will be met with resistance from the army, not just the population. And of course, if there is conflict that takes place of that nature in the continent, then the possibilities of other uprisings taking place are extremely likely. So I wouldn't rule it out at all, no.
Jacques Arnauld, distinguished former parliamentarian, conservative, sympathetic, if I'm not wrong, to the events unfolding from the right in Latin America, at least an able and willing analyst of that. If so, kindly give us your perspective.
Well, George, all attention is focused on Bolivia with the rather dramatic news that we've had of late. And what I find particularly tragic is Evo Morales is making the same mistake that you are, that you're staying on far too long in politics.
I will die in politics.
He, at the end of the day, was trying to get himself re-elected for a fourth term. In the last year or two, it has been quite obvious that his personal support is waning. And the tragedy is that he has not got himself elected, For the fourth time, the OAS, the Organization of American States, has analyzed it and come to the conclusion there are far too many doubts over that election. And I think he obviously accepts the fact because he has removed himself from the scene. Now,
Well, it might have been killed otherwise.
I think a serious problem, too common in politics, is that great leaders don't create acorns growing under their canopy, and I think this Bolivia seems to be an absolutely good example, because we have the Senate of the country, that its top person is interim president, announcing there will be another election, and if the former regime supporters have the support that they claim, obviously at an election they would get themselves elected to take.
You're confident that Morales would be allowed to stand?
The challenge with that movement is to produce a new presidential person to come to take Bolivia forward fully into the 21st century. So
you're confident that Evo Morales would be allowed to stand in new elections?
I really don't know. The facts of the matter is Latin American presidents very frequently want to carry on indefinitely. There was a case in Colombia where an attempt was to change the law so that an incumbent president could stand yet again, and here we see the same phenomenon in Bolivia.
The Supreme Court ruled it legal, of course, that he could stand again.
Yes, and there are doubts about that too. But what I think needs to be developed in Bolivia is that we've got democracy right the way across the South American continent. Bolivia is a democracy. The outgoing president has, for many years, served his country well. An interesting phenomenon being the first president from the indigenous community. There was previously a vice president of Bolivia from the same community. The challenge for Bolivia, in my view, is that when this election comes, that the interim president has said will be coming shortly, will be to take Bolivia democratically for the future in the 21st century.
Thank you. Madame.
Well, the first thing that I want to say, it was a coup d'etat, what happens in Bolivia, and we can see all the smoking guns. The meeting of Carlos Mesa with Tarre Briceño, who is the fake ambassador of Venezuela in the OAS, and with Duque. The fact that Camacho sent a Twitter 2 months ago saying, "Thank you, Venezuela," referring to this interim President Guaido, thanks to Brazil and Colombia, and basically bending on getting rid of Evo. The audios that have come to light about Mesa talking and being in touch with Ted Cruz, which this definitely shows that is a conspiracy. But I want to put a little bit the accent on why this is happening. Camacho is, I don't remember the name, but Luis Fernandez Camacho, his family used to be the owners of the distribution of gas. I think it was called Sergas or something, in Bolivia. When Evo Morales came, that was taken to the state. Basically, the Bolivian government claimed that back. His family owns millions to the Bolivian government still. And this is, and not just, he's a lawyer, 40 years old. He has these committees of extreme right-wing Catholic fascists, basically. We saw the burning of all the books of Linera, and we need to think about what they want. And it's basically to take control of the resources of Bolivia. Bolivia is the country that has the biggest reserve of lithium in the world. Between 50 and 70% of lithium is in Bolivia. And this is the resource that the big economic powers need for the new Green Deal in the United States, for the new economy that they want to build away from fossil fuels. So they need the gas from Bolivia, but they need the lithium. You have a battery to run a car. The battery costs $1,200. Of these $1,200, $15 is the price of the lithium in that. And they need a lot of that to run the cars that we're going to have, the mobiles that we're going to have. This is a coup d'etat organized from the deep inside these groups that are basically trying to take hold on the resources Bolivia has.
The lithium question has now grown larger with suspicion that because of the deal with China to sell the lithium to China, that this may have been a trigger point for the United States. Do you see anything in that?
It could have been. Evo Morales just signed 10 contracts with China, which very interestingly has been very quiet about this coup d'etat. We know that he actually canceled a contract with a company in Germany as well. So we have a situation where these groups are basically playing some geopolitical game, basically, trying to get hold of all these resources.
And what about the ethnicity point I put to Dr. Isaac, that it seems to me the main losers in this coup are the indigenous ethnic majority in Bolivia. Am I right?
Of course, and we have seen scenes in Twitter, because we're not going to see this in the big media, of course, of people being asked to kneel, indigenous people kneeling, being abused by the security forces, by the thugs that were actually paid for by Mesa, Carlos Mesa, and Camacho. We're looking here at a new edition of the struggle that started when the Spanish came to the Latin American continent. This is a battle that started in 1491 when they first arrived there. And this is another chapter. And they are obviously, humiliating people. They are destroying the hands of people. People don't know this because the big media won't show it. But the abuse that is going on is horrendous. And going back to these terrible stories of the Spanish, how they treated the indigenous people. This is definitely a race battle. And the racists and fascists are at the top at the moment. But I think it's going to be a very unstable situation for them.
Strong feelings, powerful emotions. More of this after the break. You're watching Kalamahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Latin America, where, as always, recently, momentous events are underway. We took the Kalamahora camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Who is Alberto Fernandez to you?
I'm not familiar with Alberto Fernandez. I do know that I was in Buenos Aires recently, down in Argentina, and the unemployment, the economy was suffering. There were strikes across the board. I know the university was striking at the time, and all of the students that would have been in university were out of university protesting the current government, the right-wing government at the time. So I think that him being left-wing is what people are looking for down there right now.
I hope it's a good thing for Argentina now.
It's a breakthrough in politics because the previous one was right-wing and conservative and pro-US, so that is a big change in South America, I believe.
Okay, maybe he could be good for Argentina. Changes always are good.
There is actually a 1 in 10 unemployment rate in Argentina. How do you think he might fare in his attempts to resolve the unemployment issue?
Hopefully it works. Hopefully what he has in store will bring more jobs, more employment. If nothing else, it will bring the social structure that's needed to help people get a footing.
Well, basically, if you look at the area, which is South America, I think unemployment is pretty high anyway. So all the other countries, Brazil, Mexico, and everything are suffering unemployment. So it's going to be like a big challenge for him.
I think it's a big swift in politics because it's a main issue in South America. There's been a history of unemployment, and I think he's going to bring back more sociable values and left-wing values and employment for everyone, so more equity in the landscape of politics. Yeah.
We will see. Yeah, maybe in few months or few years after his election.
How do you think the election of a left-wing government might affect the political landscape in Latin America?
I think it's going to bring a lot of instability, and it's going to be a major revolution in the political landscape of South America.
I mean, they've been right-wing for a certain time, so maybe Argentina needed a change, but for the global landscape in South America, I don't really think it's going to have an impact.
I'm from Canada, so we see what we call it a blue wave that we're seeing everywhere right now. That right-wing conservative governments are being elected, not just in Latin America, but everywhere in the world. It's happening. And I think that seeing more left-wing governments being elected is a reaction to that. People may be seeing that it's not working, that they're not getting what they want out of it. And the election of left-wing parties is a reaction to that right now.
Two rather surprising developments. One, the victory in Argentina for the Peronists, who I thought were probably dead and buried after the judicial coup against Cristina Kirchner, and the release of Lula from prison. These are they surprises, and what impact will they make?
My name is Victor Fraga. I'm a Brazilian filmmaker, and the release of Lula from prison is going to is an earthquake. It's a political earthquake. We must not underestimate the importance of Lula being out of prison. American imperialism has found several weapons, new weapons in Latin America. And historically, if you look at Operation Condor, they would use military coups to overthrow governments. The history of Latin America is dotted with coups, military and parliamentary coups throughout history in nearly every country, and every single coup without exception being supported by the US. And in the past, the enemies were the communists. With obviously with the demise of the European of the Soviet Union, communism is not such a big threat. So they're using new weapons. One of the weapons is alleged corruption, which is paired with something else called lawfare. So a very large lawfare campaign was orchestrated against Lula, because Lula was set to win the elections in the very first round. Bolsonaro wouldn't even have half the votes. Lula was at 40%, Bolsonaro was at 20%. So they created charges which don't exist. They allege that he owns a flat on the beach. The charges are Kafkaesque, and the process is mired with corruption itself. But the US has found, and this is not me saying that. If you look at the first Conference of the Americas in 1994 in Miami, the US clearly stated that they were going to use corruption, the fight against corruption, as a weapon. That was obviously 4 years after the demise of the Soviet Union, and the fight against corruption has been weaponized to destabilize countries across South America. We must not understate the gravity of what happened in Bolivia, because this is the first military coup that we've seen this century in South America. There were 3 parliamentary coups, one in Honduras under Zelaya, one in Paraguay under Lugo, and one in Brazil under Dilma, but none of them were violent military coups. Let me remind you, in 1964, we had a military coup in Brazil. We had a military coup now in Bolivia. In 1964, the military promised elections within a few months of the coup. It took 25 years for Brazil to see elections again in 1989. What happened to the political leader, Jango, who went into exile? He was poisoned by the CIA. Years later, it was revealed that it was indeed the CIA that poisoned him while he lived in exile in Uruguay. If they were just challenging how Morales was elected, it would allow Morales to run again because he would win again. This is a parliamentary coup, far more serious because it opens up a new precedent, and we're seeing a very dangerous reactionary movement with religious fundamentalists, which is far more profound than what we saw in Brazil. On the positive side, obviously, we're seeing Lula out of prison, and the importance of Lula being out of prison and of Fernandez being elected in Argentina must not be understated. That there is a lot of reaction. People are waking up. Natural resources are playing a major role. So we're talking about lithium in Bolivia. We're talking about oil in Brazil, what we call the pre-salt layers being handed over. So it is an anti-hegemonic, there is a hegemonic movement being orchestrated with the help of, the fight against corruption and lawfare. But we are seeing genuinely anti-neoliberal governments and anti-neoliberal movements in South America.
Let's hear from a lady from Bolivia. Madame, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. One of the biggest problems we had in Bolivia over the years is that we're a rich country with a large indigenous population. The majority of the population are indigenous. However, we've had policies from the U.S., for instance, of forced sterilization of the indigenous population. We had, in 1952, we had a revolution, the most radical revolution after the 1917 revolution in Russia. So we nationalized all our main industries, and afterwards our revolution was defeated slowly through neoliberal coups and government. We managed to recover our power in 2003 with the Goni Sanchez de Lozada, when he took the army out in the streets and murdered people with war weapons. And he's hiding in the USA, in Miami, protected by the US government. We've tried to have him respond for his crimes, and a jury found him guilty. And the judge quashed that because the Mesa, who was his vice president, who was supposed to be a witness for us in our side, he refused to go, and he didn't stand as a witness. So that's Mesa. Mesa is from the neoliberal time, is part of the murder of people in Bolivia, and people have memory in Bolivia. And we haven't forgotten. Of course, Mesa could not win the elections. Of course, he knew he was going to lose the elections because they've been canvassing, they've been checking and asking people, they've been trying all sorts of tactics to try and persuade people to vote for him, but people have memory. And therefore, he knew he lost, and they knew that Evo Morales was the winner long ago, before the elections. What's the problem in Bolivia? Bolivia is rich. We have natural resources. And who owns the natural resources? The rightful owners, the original people, the indigenous population. And this is why we have a new constitution. The new constitution claimed back our natural resources. We nationalized them and industrialized them. You see, for many years, we didn't have natural gas in our homes. It was all exported. And Sao Paulo depends 60% of its gas from Bolivia. So this is all to do with natural resources. Now, Evo Morales, what he has done is he has used the natural resources for the benefit of the majority, for the benefit of the people. For the first time, we have an NHS in Bolivia. For the first time, we have free education. For the first time, we have child benefit for women that are pregnant, because we realized Evo Morales read the programs in which he said it was too late to feed children well. You had to feed the mothers that were pregnant. So bonuses that were given to mothers and children and education. We eradicated illiteracy. Evo Morales is the best president we ever had in Bolivia. That didn't go well with the status quo in this country, in Europe, and in the USA. It didn't go well because through the NED, there are 2,000 NGOs in Bolivia. Through the NED, they are supported and organized groups like Rios de Pie, which are an organization that started for many years using peaceful demonstrations, peaceful actions, and trying to equate themselves. Look at this. They use left-wing jargon, left-wing tactics for right-wing purposes. So what they did is they started calling Evo Morales a dictator. They started going around how there was no freedom of press, although 100% of the press in Bolivia is controlled by the right-wing. It's a right-wing media. We have small community radios. We had the main channel, the Canal 7, but the majority were in the hands of the right wing, and there's been lies after lies. So we say that always in every war, the first victim is the truth. And that's what happened. But it started with the fire. When the fire was blamed on Evo Morales, and we even saw pickets of people, well-meaning people, that Extinction Rebellion went and picketed the Bolivian embassy, accusing them of the fire, when the fire was in Brazil. And what had happened in Chiquitania had nothing to do with Evo Morales, yet Evo Morales was blamed. And the right wing started asking and asking for the borders to be open as a distraction, saying that we need it urgent. And I've seen it in main channels in this country. So through Argentina, lots of trucks, trailers came into the country. And what do we see now? Now we see all these thugs organized with and unarmed, attacking people. And the small community radios and newspapers, the editors, the directors were attacked, stripped, tied to trees. It was like Nazi Germany. It was awful. And what do we go from here? Do we say to people, it's okay, go home and wait? No, people in Bolivia are mobilizing, are fighting, because we know what's going on. We know it took us so many generations, since 1952 to now, to get it back. And it's true, is the lithium, but not just the lithium. And what's the problem with that is that we want to industrialize. You see, this country, the UK, has benefited from our salitre,
raw materials.
The raw materials, salitre, and then and after that we had a war with Chile, which really was a war with the UK, and we had a war with Chile, and that war took away the largest copper mine in the world, which is Chuquicamata, and it was exploited by British companies, British multinationals that didn't pay any taxes. We have lithium in Bolivia. But the second lithium resources are in Chile, which were Bolivian territory in the past. And that lithium is in the hands of the Pinochet family. So this is the reality. Evo Morales wanted to industrialize the lithium. That was the real reason. The industrialization of our natural resources. We don't want to live of charity. We are rich. It's a rich country. We could live well without having to go in our knees. It is a racial issue. Okay, I will say Bolivia, the racial element is part of it, but I don't think it's the main element, because at the moment, indigenous people are fighting against indigenous people. So who are these young guys going around with the sticks and hitting people? Are our children. Are our children that have been brainwashed. They've been told that they are fighting for democracy. They are fighting against a legitimate elected president to install a right-wing, racist group. And on top of that, we have the OAS that comes to tell us, comes to legalize the claim that it was fraudulent vote in Bolivia, fraudulent election. Well, let me tell you, in Bolivia, more than 90% of the population vote because it's compulsory to vote. And out of that 90% compared to this country, where I think the majority don't vote. And of that, 47% was the vote that Evo Morales got. More than 10% of the vote needed for him to win. He is the legitimate president of Bolivia.
Okay, thank you for that. Jacques, you contest this prevailing narrative, at least prevailing in here, of the Latin American masses being dominated by the United States, being exploited by the big landowners, the big families, the oligarchies. You contest this narrative. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, I think it's very significant that Latin America now, for recent decades, has been back in full democracy. What we're hearing is losers inventing conspiracy theories. What really counts is winning elections. And if you go to Argentina, there was an election win. But I think there is a very serious situation in Argentina, because if one casts one's mind back 4 years, why on earth was Macri elected in the first place? And it was because the Argentine people were absolutely revolted by the corruption and the debt created by the successive Kirchner governments. What I think is a warning for Latin America is Macri, a competent businessman, failed to turn around the economic and debt
situation.
situation.
Dramatically worse, didn't it?
Precisely the point, George. What has happened is
elect him
even
again.
with the business capability of Macri, the economy and the debt situation of Argentina was not turned around, and in continuing desperation, the electorate has reverted to Peronism, which was the problem in Argentina in the first place. So it is a major problem, the debt and economic situation, and the idea that Argentina, under the new president, much as we might all hope, is unlikely to get Argentina out of those mires.
Madame.
Carolina Graterol, journalist and filmmaker. When Macri arrived to power, the external debt of Argentina, and you can check this, was $150 million. That's what it was, $150 million. What happened with Macri in these 3 years has gone to $217,000 million. The increase has been 1,373 times. And this, you can check these figures, because
I
that
hope he's a better
super check.
businessman than he is a president.
I'm telling you, Macri has, the debt will take 100 years to pay. The situation that the two Fernandez are going to find is going to be very, very tricky, thanks to Macri. Complete incompetence, and also selling and indebting. Why do they do that? Why did he need it? Because the International Monetary Fund needs to put hands on the economies in America. How can they do it? Offering these loans at 4%. But what happened with the loans? The loans come with some conditions. The conditions are selling assets of the government to private companies. What a surprise. The private companies that possibly are behind the International Monetary Fund that are going to make a killing. Many other reasons. This is what is really happening in Argentina. So
let's hear from the lady on the end.
I'm part Amerindia myself. I'm part Pataxó, Minuano, Caigangue tribes, Central American, North American, Native American. And we know that they have ecological practices going on that we can learn from each other. This is the century of actually exchanging information, addressing inequalities in the sense of actually looking at equality at not only recognition of all the people that, as you're saying, women, pregnancy, that affects the entirety of the genetic development of a child and a whole population, but also how we distribute. And the natural resources, they belong to the people who live in those areas. And then we already know the practices where actually a very small minority has been taking and consuming most of the resources in the planet, has led to a kind of level of desire to die and mortality that actually there's an increased level of suicide among young people. I remember once in the bus, someone who was taking medication for schizophrenia told me, Marcia, just look around. Everyone here is taking some form of drug, legal or illegal, to cope with life. We are not to believe like this. We are intelligent, as we call ourselves. And this, in Latin America, what's happening at the moment, I hope will be a wake-up call, because we are very intelligent people. And putting our heads together, we'll find a way out. We'll not to repeat history, but create new stories among ourselves. Another thing that I'd like to mention is there is a movement that demands and expects young people to vote whenever they will to, in whichever age. There is a solution to have prisoners of consciousness not being entitled to actually be elected, which is for all people to have the human rights to elect people and to be elected. People in prison have the right to give their opinion, to be representatives. And for 10,000 of years, we have had representation of a part of the population, half of the population, that has not yielded as many results as we have hoped. So for now, as the women from Iraq in a protest said, if we have 50% of women in all governments not being politicized and being puppets or control or competing with the existing status quo, but 50% of women in the entire world in the 21st century, we'll sort this out.
Well, you obviously didn't live under Margaret Thatcher. Last word to you, Dr. Isaac. Sum up what the immediate, short-term, likely outcome of all these events will be. But I'd like a word from you on, if God spares us and we're still talking about this 10 years from now, are we still going to be in this maelstrom, or will there be stability and consensus in Latin America?
I want to talk a little bit about democracy and the Organization of the American States, because every time that there is a left-wing government elected, there is a kind of coup d'etat. In Paraguay, parliamentary coup d'etat. In Honduras, a coup d'etat. In Honduras, we had rigged elections, but the Organization of American States didn't say absolutely nothing. For 71 years, we have the OAS. They supported Duvalier in Haiti, the dictatorship of Brazil for 21 years, Pinochet in Chile, Uruguay, Bordaberry, Videla in Argentina, every kind of dictatorship, Somoza, Batista, they completely supported all of these regimes. And as soon as you have a left-wing government, they said, oh, it's fraud, and we need to overcome this government, supporting the parliament against them. And in the case of Bolivia, it's incredible. The parliament has they have a minority in the parliament, in the votes, but they put a lady that has never been voted by anybody. So democracy in this continent is not supported or backed by the USA. And even Donald Trump, he lost the election by 3 million votes. What authority he has to ask for democracy in Latin America? He always is undermining democracy. At the moment, he's not undermining Mexico, but he's going to do the same in Mexico. And the other thing is this, about the Organization of American States. It appears like they are the referees. They are not the referees. They always take side. If they find some mistakes in Venezuela or in Bolivia, it's the end of the world. But if in Colombia they are killing hundreds and hundreds of social leaders, they don't do absolutely nothing. In Haiti, nobody's talking that they canceled the election at the same time that we had election in Uruguay and Argentina. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking that in Haiti, less than 1/5 of the population voted. So which kind of democracy is the United States that always imposed? I see, you ask me now about what could happen in Latin America. In Latin America, we are never going to grow until we are not going to be liberated from the United States. United States is our big brother, but he is giving like a bear embrace. So we need the support of the US people, the North American people, to fight against the Democrats, the Republicans in the United States, because they are the main problem in Latin America. The big US corporations, they are the ones that always are going to undermine any progressive step in Latin America.
And you see that continuing? Or is this, Bolivia notwithstanding, a kind of reawakening of the kind of mass politics we discussed earlier?
I think that the United States has always done that, are always going to do that. They have invaded Latin America several times. They have invaded Cuba, they had Puerto Rico in their own hand, they had invaded the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, so and so on. They are going to continue. And what we are going to see in the future, we are going to see a lot of mass upheavals. What we have seen in Chile and Ecuador is only the first step. I think that we are going to have something in Peru. In Peru, is a volcano is waiting because people are fed up with neoliberal policies, with corruption. We are also going to have a volcano in Brazil because I don't see that people are going to be happy with Bolsonaro. No, I think that we are going to have a lot of Vulcanos in Latin America.
Can Lula come back to power?
Yes, I think that Lula might come back to power, and also Evo Morales might come back to power, because Bolsonaro is not achieving too much progress in Brazil. He is becoming very much unpopular at the moment. Of course, that Bolsonaro led some opinion polls, is true, but he's becoming more and more unpopular with the middle classes, with the indigenous people, with the poor people, on the international level. I don't think that Bolsonaro is going to last too much time.
Jack, a very last word from you and a quick one.
And a quick one. What you've said, Professor, is quite clearly that democracy lies in the hands of the Latin Americans. You refer to the possibility of Lula, of Morales returning. Well, if they return, it will be due to democracy and the popular will of the countries concerned, and that represents the hope for the future of Latin America.
Well, a rare moment of consensus. This argument will run and run. I've been George Galloway. You've been a magnificent audience. This has been Kale Mohora on Al Mayadeen Television. Thank you for watching.